Here is some footage from some of the widespread protests that are happening in Iran. A few nights ago, the exiled leader called for these protests, and some government buildings were even set on fire. And then here you see thousands of the Iranian diaspora in London basically calling for freedom in Iran. And here we see the president of the European Parliament supporting the protest movement. And this could matter for America because Donald Trump has warned the regime that if they get violent with protesters, there's going to be consequences. And the regime has cut off internet access in Iran, so we aren't getting as much information out of Iran as we were before. And CNN is reporting that hundreds of protesters have been targeted. I've heard even thousands. And so apparently Donald Trump is weighing his military options in Iran. So I thought it'd be worth it to get educated on what is going on with this authoritarian regime in Iran and what would this all mean for America and the rest of the world. And from my research, the moral case against the Iranian theocracy is pretty clear, especially when it comes to violence against women. These protests aren't new. There was this woman, Mahsa Amini, this is her. The morality police did this to her. So I looked into what this whole morality police thing is, especially in the context of women. So they're called the Ghast-e-Irsad, and they are there to enforce Sharia law. This is what they look like. I was actually surprised that it is typically a male crew that is accompanied by women in this particular dress. And apparently even young women are forced to wear the hijab in Iran, and the consequences for not wearing the hijab can be pretty brutal. And I was also surprised to find out that the Iranian regime uses traffic cameras, CCTV camera systems, cameras at cafes, universities, and even schools to basically monitor the dress code of females across the country. And I learned that in 2022, there were widespread protests after the Mahsa Amini incident. And the Iranian theocracy responded by intensifying repression of women. They introduced flogging as a punishment for hijab violation. And they even used SA basically as a punishment for these women. And I also learned that Iran has this dubious title because the regime's idea of justice, led by this guy, Gholam Hossein Mohseni Ejei, he is the chief justice of Iran under the theocracy. And it appears that sham trials are just commonplace across Iran. And the Iranian economy is in tatters. I learned that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is basically constantly smuggling money out of the country, and there's a lot of corruption. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard, for example, currently controls the entire oil industry in Iran. And there's this interesting concept of bonyads. So on the face of it, these bonyads are these religious and charitable foundations. But really what they are is they are sort of a business entity that operates outside of the framework of Iran's regular population, and instead they're controlled directly by the office of the supreme leader. Here is the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. So he's basically at the top of Iran's kleptocracy, and this is a fancy word for basically corruption. And apparently his wealth is somewhere around $200 billion. And he uses his wealth basically to fund the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. But his people are definitely enjoying the wealth as well. His grandson was photographed wearing designer clothes at an upscale horse facility, and his granddaughter was identified in London recently with a $3,800 Dolce & Gabbana handbag. The supreme leader uses a lot of his money to control and basically fund military projects. This has been happening for a while. And this is how it impacts kind of the rest of the world, because a lot of these projects aren't in Iran. Like he gave Hezbollah, which is in Lebanon, a different country, about $1 billion. While the people of Iran faced a drug shortage, they had to ration baby formula and even medication. And all this Iran Revolutionary Guard money, Supreme Leader money, was going to these groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis in Yemen. They're basically sending the money around the world to fund the Supreme Leader's vision, which is clearly a pretty gnarly vision for the world. And it seems like publicly he says, oh, we're just working with Iran to develop nuclear power plants. But then at the same time, he's saying, hey, listen, building an atomic bomb, it would be easy for us. Which is problematic because if Iran develops nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia said that they want to develop nuclear weapons too. So it seems like if the Supreme Leader's vision is realized, there's going to be a bunch of nuclear weapons spread across the Middle East. And Iran sits on a bunch of oil and also has the world's second largest natural gas reserves, which is important because the EU gets a lot of its energy from natural gas. And if Iran was not led by an extreme supreme leader, there would be a lot more stability in Europe. And it would also mean that Europe doesn't have to give Russia so much money for natural gas, which is already a problem. And it looks like Iran has basically been trying to organize a military alliance that's against basically the democratic West, including being the manufacturing hub for these drones that are being used by Russia for attacks in Ukraine, which just means that a lot of the power behind Russia's offensive efforts is actually associated with Iran and the supreme leader. Moreover, Iran is using its military ties to Russia to counteract these Abraham Accords, which is basically a plan for peace and prosperity across the Middle East that has a bunch of nations involved in it that don't want to be at war with each other. But if the supreme leader was to leave or get kicked out or whatever, we wouldn't be exactly sure who would lead Iran. There's this guy, Reza Pahlavi. He's the crown prince of Iran, so related to the old monarchy. He's been organizing a lot of the protests, and he basically is a Western-aligned person. He supports liberal democracy, a constitutional monarchy, and importantly, he wants to be an ally of both the Western world and Israel. But another contender is the People's Mojahedin organization. This was an armed group until 2023, and then it became a political group in Iran. And it's not as Western aligned. It's influenced by Islam and revolutionary Marxism. And apparently these guys are really well organized, so they might be the organization to lead Iran if the supreme leader was to fall. But I think for people all over the world, if the supreme leader's rule ended, it would really change everything in the world. And so now apparently Trump is looking at what to do. Do you think he should do anything in Iran?